All right, you don't see this very often. A guy declares he's running for president and gets 14% support among Democrats in a potential matchup to take on the president of the United States. That Democrat is Robert F. Kennedy Jr., the eldest son of the late senator, presidential candidate, and attorney general. He joins us now. Robert, very good to have you.
Good to be back with you, Neil. It's been a long time.
It has, too long. You know, those are incredible numbers, Robert. I mean, you're polling 14%, and you know, what's remarkable is a good part of that 14% isn't coming from your family. Many of them are not keen on you taking on the president, and I'm just wondering why that is. Now, I know 3 of them are diplomats in the Biden administration, so that makes sense. Others, though, they're holding back. Why is that?
Well, you know, I don't agree with my family on all issues. My family, first of all, including myself, have a long relationship with Joe Biden and a friendship. And Joe Biden has a bust of my dad behind him and on almost every photo shoot on his desk. So that the bond between our families is very, very close. And then many of my family members, as you say, are working in the administration. But other my family members just don't agree with me on issues on censorship, on the war, on public health issues. You know, we're a big family, and I have a lot of people who are with me, but other ones disagree with me, and I respect that. I have no ill will towards any of them. I think we're like every family. There are disagreements in the Kennedy family too, and I think, you know, we know how to love each other and at the same time disagree with each other on political issues or other issues. And I think, you know, my hope is that our country can do that as well, that we can learn, you know, the polarization in this country is now toxic and radioactive than any time since the Civil War. It's really both Republicans and Democrats talk about it in almost apocalyptical terms, that, you know, they do not see a way out of it. And I think we need to find a way to be able to talk to each other and disagree with each other without hating each other.
Well, there's a concept. I don't even want to get you started, Robert, on the Cavuto family and their politics. But having said that, I mean, a lot of people know you on your anti-vaccine views long before COVID. I think your niece had said your views are unfounded and potentially dangerous. And that's going to come up in this campaign if it hasn't already. How do you answer that here? There are many in your party who will argue, and others, that vaccines work. They took a crisis and what could have been a plague across the world and seriously cut down on the deaths that would have been a lot higher without it, you say?
Well, I would disagree with you on that. I don't think the science supports that. I don't think you can show me any scientific study that shows that. In fact, the nations that didn't vaccinate had the lowest death rate. For example, Nigeria had a 1.5 vaccination rate, and it had a 14 deaths per 1,000. We had 14 deaths per million population. We had 3,000 deaths per million population. Haiti had the same thing, almost no vaccination, and had 15 deaths per million population. So they had 1/200th of the deaths that we had. We were one of the most heavily vaccinated countries in the world. We had the highest death rate in the world. We have 4.2% of the world's population. We had 16% of the COVID deaths. Well, that's not a success story. And if you look around the world, the nations that were the least vaccinated did the best in terms of preventing COVID mortalities. And particularly the nations that used alternative treatments like ivermectin and hydroxychloroquine. You can look state by state in India, country by country, and one after the other. That's what the data show. So I don't think
you sound a lot like Donald Trump. He kind of espoused similar views.
I don't think he did. Donald Trump continues to say that his vaccination saved the world, and I just don't think the science is out there.
But no, you mentioned hydroxychloroquine and some of these other treatments. He did as well.
Well, he did, but he didn't let people have access to them. And as I said, the nations that gave people access to those treatments had much, much lower death rates and ended in many cases the pandemic.
Okay, we could go back and forth on this. I'm sure you're prepared. This will be a big issue as you take on the president of the United States.
All day on that.
Right. Could I ask you though? You know, this is the first time a prominent Kennedy is taking on an incumbent president. I was referring in the earlier in the show to your Uncle Ted Kennedy when he took on Jimmy Carter in 1980. He got a lot of attention, didn't get the nomination. Many argue that it weakened Jimmy Carter. And of course, we know what happened that year. Are you afraid that that same thing could happen to you, that with the best of intentions, you could weaken Joe Biden if you don't get the nomination and the ticket goes down to flaming defeat?
Right now, Neil, the polls show President Biden losing to Donald Trump, who is the presumptive nominee of the Republican Party. I'm in a better position to run against Donald Trump than any of the Democrats because I can hold him accountable for the worst thing that he did, which was the lockdowns. The lockdowns were absolutely catastrophic. The lockdowns, we now know, the countries that had less lockdowns than the states, you can put them again side by side. And those are the countries. Sweden, for example, was the only country in Europe that didn't do lockdowns. It had the lowest death rate in Europe. We led the world in lockdowns. We had the highest death rate from COVID in the world. But worst of all is what it did to the economy. It cost $16 trillion, according to Larry Summers' report, the IMF report, the Harvard report. We shifted $4 trillion in wealth from the American middle class to this new aristocracy of billionaires. We created 500 new billionaires. The Oxfam report, which came out this week, shows that the billionaires that existed at the beginning of the pandemic, the people like Bill Gates, Mark Zuckerberg, Jeffrey Bezos, Bloomberg, et cetera, increased their wealth by 30% during the pandemic. And at that time, during the lockdowns, Amazon got to shut down all of its competitors.
So the lockdown actually perpetuated this class divide. You mentioned the wealthy and how they were affected. Obviously, you come from a wealthy family. The Kennedy family certainly was for a while among the richest in the world. Now, Elizabeth Warren, your senator from Massachusetts, wants to kick around a wealth tax where the assets that rich people have would be taxed, not just at the income rate. Are you open to that? What do you think of that idea? Because families like yours would pay for that.
I would have to look at that. I mean, I don't think these huge disparities in wealth are healthy for our country or healthy for democracy. I think it's to have very, very high concentrations of wealth in a nation that now is marked by widespread poverty is something that...
No, you're right. But through no fault of your own, you're part of that concentration of wealth, right? So I guess, do you like the idea that wealthy people and wealthy families, they don't depend on income, they have assets, humongous assets, and that she and others, the progressives in your party, are keen on taxing those?
You know, I have to look at that, Neil. I have not looked at it, but I do think we have to address those kind of disparities in wealth. And that we have to, more than anything, we have to rebuild the American middle class. And part of that is getting away from the warfare economy and doing what China originally did, which is to build its power and project power by building its economy at home. The strength of a nation comes from a strong economy and a vibrant middle class. And we have wiped out the middle class in this country systematically. And a lot of that.
So your race would be about that, but a lot of people say you're going to be more of a pacifist as a president if they ever came. You said about the war in Ukraine that it's a misplaced priority. Real quickly, what did you mean by that?
Well, I don't believe I used that language, but what I said about the war in Ukraine is we need to get a very, very clear idea from our government about what our purpose is in the Ukraine. You know, my son fought in the Ukraine. The American people are very, very supportive of the Ukrainian people, of the brutality, of the angry at the illegal and brutal invasion by Russia and admiring of the courage and the valor of the Ukrainian people. As I said, my son fought there. He was a machine gunner for a special forces unit. We went over there being told that this was a humanitarian mission. And now President Biden is saying that we're there because we want regime change in Russia, which is the same thing the neocons did in Iraq with catastrophic results.
So if you became president, Robert, I just want to be clear, you would put a stop to it?
Yeah, I would I would pressure if the parties to enter a ceasefire and then to negotiate a settlement. I mean, our objective over there should be to prevent bloodshed and to prevent suffering and the destruction of the Ukraine. There's 300,000 Ukrainian troops who have already died in this war. And, it's become a proxy war between the United States and Russia. And, the poor Ukraine is caught between those, in that abattoir and is being grounded to dust. And now, if this war continues...
But without our help, Robert, the argument goes that there would be more obliteration in Ukraine, that hundreds of thousands of more Ukrainians would die. They would lose their country. What do you say?
Well, except that both the Russians and the at least the Donbass region was willing to settle the whole thing and walk away with the Minsk Accord, which seemed like a very, very reasonable settlement. That the Donbass got autonomy within Ukraine, that NATO withdraws the threat to go into Ukraine, and that the United States remove the Axios missile systems, which are nuclear capable. When the Russians put missiles in Cuba in 1962, when my uncle was president, we were ready to invade. The Russians, I think, have an objection to us putting those kind of missile systems that can deliver 70 miles from their border. Can deliver nuclear.
That would I get it. That would stop with you. Let me get a quick take, because you have criticized some of these bank bailouts. I think Silicon Valley Bank came to mind, and how we rescued a lot of very rich depositors, and that you were concerned this went too far. Do you think, in retrospect, what the administration did in the case of Silicon Valley and other banks, and working with the Federal Reserve and the Treasury, was a mistake? That we'll look back at that to say it was a mistake?
I can't say that we'll say that was a mistake. I think in the long run, it probably was a mistake, because I don't see, Neil, I don't understand how, if you keep bailing out the banks when they make mistakes, there's a moral hazard there, where now the incentive to the bankers, the economic incentive, if you believe in free market capitalism, you've given these bankers now an economic incentive to swing for the fences every time, hoping to hit a home run, make themselves billionaires. And whenever they miss, which is a lot, the taxpayer comes in and bails them out. The same month we bailed out those banks with we printed 300 billion new dollars. We gave 113 billion. We committed that same month in March to the Ukraine. We cut food stamps for 30 million Americans by 90%. We removed 15 million Americans from the Medicare rolls. There's something wrong with our country, and we have 76% inflation over the last 2 years with basic foodstuffs. We're taking money away from the poor, and we're giving it to rich bankers. Does that make sense to anybody? And we're creating an incentive system that over the long term is just going to encourage them to do it again and again, and then the Fed prints the money to bail them out, and then we're borrowing $6 billion a day from China and Japan to pay for those bankers. And meanwhile, we're starving the poor in our country. It just makes no sense.
Finally, I'd be curious what you make. You're taking on the President of the United States. Never an easy task. Your father took on President Lyndon Johnson over the war in Vietnam. Caused great divisiveness, certainly within the party, especially when Lyndon Johnson opted not to run after Eugene McCarthy did so well in New Hampshire. Your father entered the race. Tragically, we know how that ended. He took a lot of grief for that division within the party and taking on a president. do you feel any pangs of pain taking on this president?
Well, yeah, I don't, it's like running against somebody in your family, but, ultimately, I think I'm in a much better position to beat Donald Trump than Joe Biden is. And I also just disagree with him on basic issues like my father did with Lyndon Johnson on censorship. I don't that the White House should be censoring its political, critics. I don't think. I think what we're doing in this war is unnecessarily prolonging it and unnecessarily hiking up the bloodshed. I disagree with that. I disagree with some of the public health policies of this administration. So I think, like my dad ran on principle, he did not believe that he could win. And his objective was to tell the truth to the American people, and that's what I'm going to do. And if there's an appetite for that, I'll be in the White House in 2025.
I lied when I said that was my last question because you raise another one. There's a great sacrifice when anyone runs for president, a physical risk, as your father and your uncle knew. I don't like to be morbid about these things, so I apologize in advance for even asking this. Do you think of that?
I don't really. I mean, I'm clearly aware of that risk, but there's things that I'm much more frightened of than death, for example. I'm much more frightened of losing my constitutional rights and of America losing its democracy. And there was a whole generation of Americans in 1776 who put their lives on the line to give us this Constitution, who put their property on the line. And we're watching the Constitution being taken away from us. And we have to be willing to take risks.
You're a very young 69. You're younger than me, and I'm not 69, so I kind of resent that. But we have likely now, an 80-year-old president who's going up against a 76-year-old former president. They'll both be a year or two older if they get in there. And Joe Biden could be 86 if he finished his second term. Do you think you could be too old to be president or to run for president?
Are you talking about me, or are you talking about as a general principle?
No, you're 69. You're under that 80 thing. But I mention it lightly to make a point that others have said in your party. The reason why Joe Biden gets 47% support among Democrats is that they deem him to be too old. Do you think he's too old?
Well, I don't think age is the major metric. I think the metric is if is your physical health and your mental acuity. So I mean, there are people who are 80 years old who I feel are, who I meet who seem almost younger than me. So I don't think the actual chronological age is, the limiting factor. I think the more important issue is just the mental acuity.
What do you think of the president's mental acuity?
I don't know. That would be for other people to figure out. I don't know.
What do you think of Donald Trump's mental acuity?
I don't know. He seems to be able to continue to deliver his kind of withering riposts whenever they're needed and make nicknames up for people. So he can do those exercises anyway.
He's so far, it's very early, Robert, he's running away in the polls for the Republican nomination, even with some of the problems he's had, the controversies, the indictment, and et cetera. What do you think of that?
I think Donald Trump has this capacity to talk to Americans who are desperate and make them feel like they're being heard. And, some of that is by just having a really good sense for all of the kind of alchemies of demagoguery. And, there's millions and millions of Americans. I'm working now on the Norfolk Southern train wreck in East Palestine, and you go to these communities and the desperation there, it's like what I used to see in developing nations when I was a kid. I mean, our country has really changed in ways that I think Washington is out of touch with. And I think that they don't feel that they're representative anymore. They feel people in this country feel they're being lied to by the media, by the government, by all the institutions that they trusted, and they're disgusted with them and they're done. And when a guy comes along like Donald Trump who says, I'm willing to break things, you know, that appeals to people who feel like this whole system is just rigged against them. And they're right, it is rigged against them. It's completely rigged against. If you're poor in this country, you have no participation in the political process. You're being, you know, these companies, this corrupt merger of state and corporate power that has taken over the media as well. And all of these trusted institutions of democracy have now been weaponized against the poor, against the middle class in our country. And, you know, the people are desperate. We have their backs against the wall. And Donald Trump comes and says, you know, I'm a guy on a white horse who's going to look after you, and I'm going to tell the truth about what's happening. And that has a lot of appeal to people. I think, you know, we need to do the same thing in the Democratic Party, but we need to do it with somebody who is more closely aligned with, you know, with the ideals of the traditional ideals of this country. And, but I understand his appeal. I mean, if you go to these communities, there's Trump lawn signs on every lawn. You know, people are angry. Yeah. You know, they're red, angry Trump signs, and they're there because they don't feel like they're being heard, and they don't feel. A lot of them, unfortunately, don't feel like these are former Democrats. These were Kennedy Democrats. You know, some of them, a lot of them voted for Obama.
No, you're right. It is definitely a polarizing environment. In the last minute we have, and I really appreciate your time, Robert. But let me ask you, though, about that. Go ahead.
Huge interchange between Bernie voters and Trump voters. And, you know, on ideological reasons, they're utterly antithetical to each other. But, you know, my father's voters, the white voters who supported my father in 1968, many of them in 72 voted for George Wallace. The same reason. You know, people are feeling abandoned, that this system is just rigged against them.
You know, I didn't mean to jump on you there, Robert, but I was thinking of with the polarization in the parties you talk of. Certainly the Democratic Party was very polarized in 1968 when your father was running. I'm just wondering, looking at just the Democratic Party today, could your father win in that party today? Could your uncle, John Kennedy, a man who espoused tax cuts during his brief presidency and realized the to fruition, sadly, after his assassination, could either of them make it in this party today?
I don't know. And I just, as a rule, don't make those kind of speculations because,
yeah.
You know, I have 11 siblings in my family, each one of them with a claim on my dad's legacy. And I think all of us try to respect each other by not speculating about what my father would say or not say about a certain, you know, contemporary issue. And like, you know, the public, they belong to history now. And, you know, the public can make up their minds about what Robert Kennedy would have done or what John Kennedy would have done in these kind of cases, as well as perhaps I could.
I know you had talked about you want to go back to aspire to some ideals that we've forgotten as a country. I don't want to misquote you or misparaphrase you, but that was your father's wish. That was your late uncle's wish. But is it realistic? I don't want to sound cynical here. Is it realistic in this day and age?
I mean, the values that I'm talking about are just constitutional values, you know, that we ought to have free speech in this country, that we ought to have, you know, freedom of bodily autonomy, that we ought to try to treat each other, you know, that if you work hard, if you play by the rules, you ought to be able to get ahead, and that, the rich don't have these special advantages. We've turned this country into this corporate kleptocracy where the wealth is being strip mined from the middle class and poor in this country, and it's all fixed. And we need to make our regulatory agencies serve the public interest now rather than become sock puppets for the industries that they're supposed to regulate, which is exactly what's happened. NIH works for pharma, for Moderna and Pfizer. CDC and FDA do. The USDA works for Smithfield, Cargill, and Monsanto. The CIA works for Raytheon. And we're all these agencies have been captured by corporate interests and weaponized against the public. I think we can stop that.
I have a good idea where you're coming from. People can differ over the particulars, but Robert F. Kennedy Jr., I enjoyed our chat here. Historic move on the part of an historic family, the latest entrant in a presidential race that bears watching. Very good seeing you again.
You too, Neil. Thank you.
Subscribe to the Fox News YouTube channel to catch our nightly opens, stories that are changing the world and changing your life. From Tucker Carlson tonight.